Marcos Almeida stood on the sidelines, watching as the final few players jogged off the field after another training session. The tension in the air was thick, nearly suffocating. Estrella FC was a club in turmoil, and he was now the man tasked with turning things around. But it was clear from day one that the job wouldn't be easy. A traditional football powerhouse, Estrella FC had once been a top contender in the league. Now, however, they were struggling to even stay relevant. The team had suffered 5 consecutive defeats, and the board of directors had made a controversial decision. They hired Marcos, a young black coach, known for his innovative approach to football and his success with youth players. His hiring sparked debates both inside and outside the club. Many questioned his experience and whether he could handle the pressure of managing such a historic team. Others believed that his appointment had more to do with meeting diversity quotas than his actual coaching ability. For Marcos, this job was more than just a professional challenge. It was a test of his resilience, his tactics, and his ability to command respect in a world that was often quick to doubt his competence. He knew that many saw him as an outsider, an experimental solution to a deeper problem. But he had faced adversity his entire life, and this was just the latest battle. As he watched the players finish their warm-downs, he couldn't help but notice the group of veterans lingering at the edge of the field. Antonio Freitas stood among them, a shadow of his former self. Once the captain and star player, Antonio had long been the face of Estrella FC, leading them to multiple titles. But now, at 36, he was nearing the end of his career. Injuries had slowed him down and his role in the team had diminished. Yet, his influence in the locker room remained strong, especially among the older players. Antonio's presence was both a blessing and a curse. His experience could have been a valuable asset to Marcos, but it quickly became apparent that Antonio was not on board with the new regime. From the moment Marcos arrived, Antonio had been cold, dismissive even, and it wasn't long before the tension between them boiled over. In the first team meeting, Marcos outlined his vision for the club. He emphasized the need for a modern approach to the game, focusing on fast, fluid attacking football. The players, particularly the younger ones, listened attentively, but halfway through Marcos' explanation of his tactical plans, Antonio interrupted. "This isn't a youth academy," Antonio said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think these boys are ready to play your fancy tactics? They barely understand the basics." The room fell silent. All eyes shifted to Marcos, waiting to see how he would respond. The younger players looked anxious, not wanting to offend Antonio, a club legend, but also eager to impress their new coach. The veterans, meanwhile, exchanged knowing glances, already forming their own opinions about the direction things were heading. Marcos took a breath, maintaining his composure. "I understand your concern, Antonio," he said evenly. "But football is evolving, and so must we. If we stick to the old ways, we'll keep getting the same results we've had these past few weeks. We need to trust in the process and adapt." Antonio scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "This club has history. We don't need experiments. We need results. You might think you're some tactical genius, but this team needs a coach who knows how to win, not some outsider playing with theories." The word outsider hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcos had heard it before, many times in his career, and he knew exactly what Antonio meant. But he refused to let it derail him. "We'll see if the results come," Marcos replied, his voice firm but calm. "I believe in these players. I believe in this team. If we work together, we can turn this around." But as he spoke, he could feel the weight of Antonio's stare. It was more than just skepticism. It was resistance. Marcos knew then that earning Antonio's respect, and that of the other veterans, would be his greatest challenge. Yet, he couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Later that evening, after the players had left the training ground, Marcos found himself in his office, staring at the whiteboard filled with formations and tactical notes. His mind replayed the tense exchange with Antonio. He understood the veterans' frustration, but there was something more insidious at play. Antonio wasn't just resistant to new tactics. He was resistant to Marcos himself. The media hadn't helped. From the moment his appointment was announced, articles had questioned whether a young black coach like Marcos could handle the pressure of managing a club as prestigious as Estrella FC. Some even hinted that the board had hired him as a way to check off a diversity box. Marcos had seen it all before: backhanded compliments, loaded questions, doubts disguised as concern. As he sat in silence, the weight of expectations pressed down on him. The fans were demanding results. The board was watching closely, and the players, especially the veterans, were waiting for any sign of weakness. But Marcos wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Pedro Lima, the young striker who had shown promise in the academy and was now being called up to the first team. "Coach, thanks for the chance today. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to prove myself." Marcos smiled slightly. At least someone believed in him. Pedro was one of the reasons Marcos had taken the job. The potential was there. The young players, the ones hungry for an opportunity, were ready to learn. And if he could win them over, maybe, just maybe, he could build a team that would silence the doubters. But as he closed the message, Marcos knew that tomorrow would bring another battle. Antonio wouldn't back down, and the veterans would continue to question his methods. The road ahead was long and filled with obstacles, but Marcos had no intention of quitting. Not now. Not ever. Marcos stood at the edge of the training field, clipboard in hand, watching as the players went through the drills he had laid out for them. The atmosphere was tense, the tension lingering in the air like a fog, making every movement on the field feel slower, heavier. The split in the squad was becoming more apparent by the day. The younger players, like Pedro Lima and others from the academy, were eager, soaking up Marcos' innovative training methods, while the veterans, led by Antonio Freitas, went through the motions with barely concealed disdain. Antonio, who had always been vocal in the locker room, was now using his influence in a more insidious way. He wasn't just challenging Marcos directly anymore. He was undermining him behind the scenes, using his status as a club legend to sow doubts among the older players. Every decision Marcos made, every tactical adjustment, was met with subtle resistance, and Antonio was at the heart of it all. During one afternoon training session, the players were practicing high-press drills, a key part of Marcos' vision for the team. The idea was to play an aggressive, fast-paced style that focused on winning the ball back high up the pitch and overwhelming the opposition with speed. For younger players like Pedro, it was an exciting prospect. For the older ones, it was exhausting. As the drill continued, Antonio jogged half-heartedly, barely pressing the opposition. His effort was half what it used to be, and Marcos noticed. "Antonio, push harder. Close down the space." Marcos shouted from the sidelines, his voice carrying across the pitch. Antonio stopped in his tracks, turning to face the coach with a smirk. "Push harder? I've been pushing harder for this club longer than you've been coaching," he said, loud enough for the other players to hear. Marcos felt the eyes of the entire squad on him. This was exactly the kind of confrontation Antonio wanted, to undermine his authority in front of the team. But Marcos wouldn't take the bait. "Everyone listen up," Marcos called out, walking toward the group of players. "If we want to turn this season around, we need to trust the system. The game is changing, and we need to change with it. I'm not asking for miracles. I'm asking for effort. So let's go again." The younger players nodded, immediately returning to their positions, ready for the next round. But Antonio crossed his arms, still standing where he was, a defiant look in his eyes. He was daring Marcos to force him to comply, daring him to do something drastic. For a moment, Marcos considered pulling Antonio from the session altogether, but he knew that would only add fuel to the fire. Instead, he looked at the rest of the team. "Everyone but Antonio. Run the drill again," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. The veterans glanced at Antonio, unsure of what to do, but slowly, they began to follow Marcos' orders. Antonio, left standing alone, looked furious. He had expected a confrontation, but Marcos had sidestepped it, making him look like the one who wasn't pulling his weight. As the players completed the drill, Marcos called an end to the session, and the team slowly made their way back to the locker room. But as they did, Antonio hung back, pulling a few of the older players aside. Men he had played with for years, men who respected him. "I told you, this guy has no idea what he's doing," Antonio muttered, just loud enough for a few of them to hear. "He's trying to turn this team into a bunch of kids running around like headless chickens. We've been playing a certain way for years. Why should we change everything just because some new guy thinks he knows better?" One of the players, Diego, a veteran midfielder nearing the end of his own career, nodded in agreement. "It's not how we used to play, that's for sure. Maybe the board should have gone for someone with more experience, someone who actually knows what it's like to win." The group of veterans continued their conversation in hushed tones as they entered the locker room. Meanwhile, the younger players, led by Pedro Lima, gathered around Marcos after practice, eager for feedback. For Pedro, these new methods were exactly what he needed. He had been stuck in the club's reserves for too long, his talent overlooked by previous managers who were reluctant to trust young players. But Marcos had seen his potential immediately. "Coach," Pedro said as he approached Marcos, wiping sweat from his forehead, "I've been working on those runs you talked about, trying to time them better, you know." Marcos smiled, clapping Pedro on the shoulder. "You're doing great, Pedro. Keep pushing yourself. You've got the talent. Now it's about refining it." Pedro beamed at the praise. The coach's belief in him was more than just words. It was an opportunity to prove himself. He was eager to earn a starting spot on the team, and Marcos was the first coach to show real faith in him. But as Pedro and the younger players left the field, Marcos couldn't help but glance back toward the locker room, where Antonio and his group had disappeared. The divide within the team was growing, and it was clear that the veterans, led by Antonio, were positioning themselves as the opposition. That evening, as Marcos reviewed the training footage in his office, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Diego, one of the veteran players who had been with the club for over a decade. "Hey, coach. Just wanted to say, some of us are finding these changes tough. I get that you're trying new things, but you gotta understand, we're not as young as we used to be. Might be worth reconsidering how hard you're pushing the older guys." Marcos stared at the message for a long moment. Diego was one of Antonio's closest allies, but this was the first time he had reached out directly. It was a calculated move, half concern, half warning. Marcos typed a quick response. "I hear you, Diego. I'll take it into consideration, but we all need to give 100% no matter our age. The game isn't waiting for anyone." He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. It was exactly as he had expected. The veterans, led by Antonio, were starting to push back harder. They weren't just resisting his tactics, they were resisting him. And if things continued like this, the division in the squad could tear the team apart. The question was, how far was Antonio willing to go? And how would Marcos keep the team together when one of its most respected players was actively working against him? Pedro Lima walked onto the training ground with a sense of determination that had been absent in him for years. Ever since Marcos arrived, he felt something had changed within him. A spark, a drive that made him push harder, run faster, and think more deeply about his game. For too long, he had been waiting for someone to recognize his potential, and finally, it seemed like that moment had come. At 21, Pedro was at the cusp of his career, having spent several seasons playing in the youth system without breaking into the senior squad. Under previous coaches, he had been seen as talented but raw, someone who might never fulfill his potential. But Marcos saw more than that. He saw a player with speed, agility, and most importantly, a hunger to prove himself. As Pedro jogged onto the field, he spotted Marcos setting up cones for the day's drills. He jogged over, eager to talk. "Morning, coach," Pedro said, his voice bright with anticipation. "I've been working on those runs you told me about, trying to time my movements better." Marcos looked up from the cones and smiled, giving Pedro an encouraging nod. Good. Positioning and timing are crucial. If you can master that, you'll start making defenders nervous. Keep at it. Those words made Pedro's chest swell with pride. The coach's confidence in him was a fuel unlike anything he had felt before. As the rest of the squad filtered onto the training ground, Pedro couldn't help but notice the way some of the older players dragged their feet, as if their hearts weren't in it. Antonio's influence was spreading, and the veterans were growing more resistant by the day. During the training session, Marcos focused on high-tempo drills, emphasizing quick transitions from defense to attack. The younger players were thriving under this new style, but the veterans, particularly Antonio, looked visibly frustrated. While Pedro ran himself ragged, trying to impress the coach, Antonio was slow, often walking during what were supposed to be sprints. At one point, Marcos had to stop the session. "Antonio," Marcos shouted from across the field, "pick up the pace. We need everyone moving with intensity." Antonio stopped in his tracks, glaring back at Marcos. He wiped the sweat from his brow with deliberate slowness, then jogged lazily to the next cone. The younger players exchanged nervous glances, unsure how this standoff would end. By the end of the session, Marcos pulled Pedro aside, giving him specific feedback on his positioning and decision-making. The two spoke quietly for several minutes, unaware that Antonio, watching from a distance, was fuming. To Antonio, this was a blatant sign of favoritism. He believed that Marcos was trying to phase him out, giving attention to a young player who had barely proven himself, while the veterans, the ones who had brought the club its glory, were being ignored. In the locker room after training, the division between the younger and older players was clearer than ever. Pedro, exhausted but energized from the session, was chatting with some of the other young players when Antonio approached, a dark cloud hanging over his expression. "Enjoy your time with the new boss, Pedro," Antonio said, his voice sharp with sarcasm. "He's making you feel pretty special, huh?" Pedro looked up, unsure how to respond. He had always respected Antonio. The veteran was a legend at the club, someone Pedro had grown up watching. But the tone in Antonio's voice was different now, bitter, almost threatening. "I'm just trying to learn," Pedro said cautiously. "Coach Almeida has a lot of good ideas. It's helping me improve." "Yeah," Antonio sneered, crossing his arms. "And what's he teaching you, huh? How to run around like a kid in the park?" "Football's not all about speed and flashy tricks, Pedro. There's more to the game than that. But I guess you wouldn't know. You've never had to carry this club on your back." The locker room fell silent as the tension between the two grew. Pedro shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to disrespect Antonio, but he couldn't let the veteran belittle his progress either. "I'm just trying to do my best for the team," Pedro said quietly. Antonio shook his head, disgusted. "You think you're doing your best? You're just playing into his hands, Pedro. He's using you. He's using all of us. He's here to make a point, not to win. He's trying to prove something. He doesn't care about this club. He's trying to make us look bad." Pedro clenched his jaw, feeling a surge of anger rising in his chest. "That's not true. He's trying to help us, help the team." But Antonio wasn't listening anymore. He turned away, muttering something under his breath as he walked toward his group of veteran players. Pedro watched him go, his fists balled at his sides, feeling a mix of frustration and disappointment. The line between the old guard and the new was becoming more distinct with every passing day. Later that evening, as Pedro lay in bed, his mind kept drifting back to what Antonio had said. He tried to shake it off, but the veteran's words lingered like a shadow over his thoughts. Was Antonio right? Was Marcos really using him, playing favorites to prove a point? The next morning, Pedro arrived at training early, eager to push himself harder than ever. As he stepped onto the pitch, he saw Marcos already there, reviewing notes on a clipboard. Pedro jogged over, unable to keep the question from bubbling to the surface. "Coach," Pedro began hesitantly, "I wanted to ask you something." Marcos looked up, his attention fully on Pedro. "What's on your mind?" Pedro shuffled his feet, unsure of how to phrase it. Do you think you're putting too much faith in me? I mean, the older players, they've been here a long time. They've done a lot for the club. Maybe they deserve more. Marcos watched him for a moment, sensing the conflict within him. He knew exactly what this was about. Pedro, Marcos said, his voice steady, I don't play favorites. I play those who are ready to give everything for the team. The veterans, Antonio included, have given a lot to this club, no doubt. But this team is about the future. And right now, you represent that future. Pedro's heart raced as he processed those words. There was something so matter-of-fact in the way Marcos said it, as though it were the simplest truth in the world. But it didn't feel simple to Pedro, not with Antonio breathing down his neck. But what if they're right? Pedro asked. What if they know something I don't? What if I'm not ready? Marcos smiled faintly. You're asking the wrong question. It's not about whether they know something you don't. It's about what you're willing to learn, what you're willing to give. I believe in you, Pedro. And I think, deep down, you believe in yourself too. Pedro didn't know how to respond. For a moment, he stood there, feeling the weight of Marcos' words sink in. He had always dreamed of moments like this, of a coach seeing something in him that others didn't. But the reality of that responsibility was heavier than he had imagined. Before Pedro could say anything more, Marcos clapped him on the shoulder. Now, let's get to work. You've got a game to win. As the days passed, Pedro threw himself into training with more focus than ever. He pushed himself to the limit, trying to prove not just to Marcos, but to himself, that he deserved the coach's faith. Meanwhile, Antonio's frustration continued to simmer. He watched Pedro with disdain, convinced that the young player was being groomed to take his place, while he and the other veterans were being left behind. In the locker room, the divide was becoming impossible to ignore. The veterans kept to themselves, speaking in hushed tones, while the younger players rallied around Marcos' leadership. The tension was palpable, and it was only a matter of time before it would come to a head. Pedro knew that the coming weeks would define his future. If he succeeded under Marcos, he could cement his place in the team. But if he failed, Antonio's words would echo in his mind forever. The day of the match had arrived, and the weight of the upcoming 90 minutes pressed down on everyone at Estrella FC. It was a home game against one of the league's most formidable opponents, a team that had dominated the standings for years. For Marcos, this was more than just a football match. It was a test of everything he had been working towards since taking over as coach. Victory could silence the doubters, but failure would almost certainly increase the pressure on him to step down. As he stood in the locker room before the game, the air was thick with tension. Marcos paced back and forth in front of the players, reviewing the game plan one last time. His strategy was bold, and it hinged on pressing high up the field, winning the ball back quickly, and exploiting the gaps left by the opposition's defense. The younger players, like Pedro Lima, looked determined, ready to follow his lead. But the veterans, led by Antonio, sat silently, arms crossed, expressions blank. Marcos could feel the divide in the room, but he couldn't address it now. There wasn't time for locker room politics. The whistle would blow in less than an hour. All right, Marcos said, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of nerves he felt. We've worked hard all week. We know what we need to do out there. Stick to the plan, stay sharp, and trust each other. We can win this. The younger players nodded, but Antonio, sitting at the back, didn't move. Marcos met his gaze for a brief moment, sensing the defiance radiating from the veteran player. As the team walked out onto the field, the roar of the crowd filled the stadium. The fans were on edge. Estrella FC was still languishing near the bottom of the table, and they needed a win to keep their hopes of climbing out of the relegation zone alive. The pressure wasn't just on the players. It was on the entire club. The first half of the game was brutal. The opposing team dominated possession, keeping Estrella FC pinned back in their own half for long stretches. Antonio, who had been given a starting role despite his recent attitude, was sluggish, barely tracking back on defense and offering little in attack. Marcos could feel the game slipping away from him, and by the 40th minute, the inevitable happened. The opposition scored. The stadium fell silent as the ball hit the back of the net. The scoreboard flashed 1-0, and the Estrella FC players stood motionless, their heads hanging. Marcos clenched his fists on the sidelines, his mind racing. He needed to change something, fast. When the halftime whistle blew, the players trudged off the field, and Marcos followed them into the locker room, his heart pounding. The team was down, and unless something changed, they were heading for another defeat. The locker room was eerily quiet as the players slumped onto the benches, drinking water and catching their breath. Marcos took a deep breath and stepped into the center of the room. He needed to be strong, to show the players that he hadn't lost faith in them, even if they were starting to lose faith in themselves. "All right, listen up," Marcos began, his voice cutting through the silence. "We're not out of this game yet. We've been playing too cautiously, too defensively. I want us to take control in the second half. Press higher. Don't give them time to think. We need to go for it." Antonio, sitting with his head down, muttered something under his breath. It was loud enough for a few players to hear, and they exchanged uneasy glances. "What was that, Antonio?" Marcos asked, his tone calm but firm. Antonio looked up, his expression hard. "This isn't going to work," he said, his voice low but filled with disdain. "We're getting over and out there because you've got us chasing the ball like idiots. If we keep this up, we'll lose 3-0. Maybe worse." The tension in the room was palpable. The younger players looked at Marcos, waiting for his response. This was a moment, they all knew it. If Marcos backed down, he would lose the locker room for good. If he stood his ground, the rift between him and the veterans would widen. Marcos walked slowly toward Antonio, standing in front of him. "You don't think we can win with this plan?" Antonio leaned back, crossing his arms. "I know we can't." Marcos nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He had expected this, but it still stung. "Fine," he said. "If you don't believe in the plan, you won't be part of it. You're coming off." The room went silent. Antonio blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting Marcos to take such a drastic step. The other players exchanged shocked glances, and Pedro, sitting near the front of the room, could feel his heart racing. This was it, the breaking point. "You're benching me?" Antonio asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "I've been at this club for over 10 years. I've captained this team to championships. You don't bench me." "I'm not benching you because of what you've done in the past," Marcos replied evenly. "I'm benching you because of what you're not doing right now." Antonio shot to his feet, his fist clenched. For a moment, it seemed like things might turn physical. The tension between the two men was palpable. Years of pride, frustration, and resentment boiling to the surface. But before Antonio could say anything, Marcos stepped back, raising his hand. "This isn't about you, Antonio," Marcos said. "It's about the team. I need players who are ready to fight, who believe in what we're trying to do. If you can't get on board, I can't use you." Antonio stared at Marcos, his chest heaving with anger. He looked around the locker room, searching for support among his teammates, but the room was still. No one moved. No one spoke. Even his closest allies, the veterans, stayed silent. They knew this was more than just a power struggle. It was about the future of the club. Antonio grabbed his water bottle and threw it against the locker, the sound echoing through the room. "This is a joke," he muttered, shaking his head as he stormed out of the locker room, slamming the door behind him. Marcos stood there for a moment, the tension in the room slowly easing. He turned to the rest of the players, his expression calm but determined. "Pedro, you're in," Marcos said, locking eyes with the young striker. "You're going to lead the attack." Pedro's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this, not today. But as he looked into Marcos' eyes, he saw something he hadn't felt in a long time. Faith. The coach believed in him, even when the rest of the team seemed lost in uncertainty. "Yes, coach," Pedro said, nodding. He stood up, his legs shaky but filled with adrenaline. This was his moment. The moment he had been waiting for ever since he joined the club's academy. The rest of the players slowly rose from their seats, the atmosphere in the room shifting. With Antonio gone, the weight of his defiance seemed to lift, and the younger players looked more energized, more focused. Marcos knew that this decision would have repercussions, but right now, all that mattered was the second half. "Let's show them what we're made of," Marcos said, his voice firm. "We're going out there to win." When the second half kicked off, Estrella FC came out with a fire that had been missing in the first 45 minutes. Pedro, now playing as the central striker, immediately made an impact. Under Marcos' guidance, the team pressed high, forcing the opposition into mistakes. Pedro's quick movements and relentless energy began to open up spaces that hadn't been there before, and slowly but surely, Estrella FC started to turn the tide. In the 65th minute, the breakthrough came. Pedro received the ball just outside the box, his back to the goal. With a deft touch, he turned, shaking off his defender, and fired a low shot into the bottom corner of the net. The stadium erupted as the ball hit the back of the net. 1-1. Marcos pumped his fist on the sidelines, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But there was no time to celebrate. There was still work to be done. With the momentum on their side, Estrella FC pushed forward again and again. Pedro was at the center of it all, linking up play, making runs, and putting the defense under constant pressure. In the 85th minute, he found himself in space again, this time on the right side of the box. He whipped in a cross, and one of the wingers rose high to meet it, heading the ball into the net. 2-1. The crowd exploded with joy, and the players mobbed each other in celebration. Pedro's name echoed through the stadium, and for the first time in a long while, hope seemed to return to Estrella FC. When the final whistle blew, the relief was palpable. The players collapsed to the ground in exhaustion, but they had done it. They had turned the game around. Marcos watched from the sidelines, his heart still racing. He knew this victory was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, and the tension with Antonio would only intensify. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, to savor the feeling of having proven, if only for a brief moment, that his way could work. The celebrations in the locker room were loud, filled with the kind of energy that only a hard-fought victory could bring. Pedro Lima sat on the bench, his legs still trembling with exhaustion, but his face was lit up with the joy of knowing he had just delivered one of the most important performances of his young career. Around him, the younger players slapped him on the back, praising him for his goal and assist. For a brief moment, it felt like everything was falling into place. Marcos Almeida stood near the door, watching the players celebrate. His mind, however, was racing. While the victory was a huge boost for the team, he knew it had come at a cost. He had benched Antonio Freitas, the club's veteran star, and the consequences of that decision were already beginning to ripple through the squad. As the players continued to celebrate, the door to the locker room swung open, and Antonio appeared, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The noise in the room died down instantly. The younger players, sensing the storm that was about to hit, backed away, retreating to their corners. The veterans remained quiet, their eyes flicking nervously between Antonio and Marcos. Antonio marched straight toward Marcos, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice low but filled with venom. "You think one win means you proved something?" Marcos stood his ground, his expression calm. He had expected this confrontation. Antonio wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide. "I made the decision I thought was best for the team," Marcos said, keeping his voice steady. "And it worked. You benched me." "Me?" Antonio's voice rose, the anger bubbling up to the surface. "You've been here for what, a few weeks? And you think you know what's best for this club? You don't know anything. You don't understand what this team means. You are just another outsider trying to make a name for yourself at my expense." Marcos took a step forward, refusing to be intimidated. "This isn't about you, Antonio. It's about the team. And today, the team won because we played together." Antonio's eyes burned with fury. He looked around the room, searching for support among his teammates, but found none. The veterans sat quietly, their loyalty to Antonio clear, but they weren't willing to risk their own positions to back him in this fight. The younger players, meanwhile, remained silent, watching from the sidelines. They had seen what had happened on the pitch today. Pedro's performance, the tactical changes that had led to their comeback victory. They knew it made the right call. "You will regret this," Antonio muttered darkly, his eyes narrowing. "I'll make sure of it." With that, he turned and stormed out of the locker room, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room lingered for a moment longer before the younger players slowly resumed their celebrations, the energy subdued but still present. Marcos watched the door swing shut, his chest tight. He had known that benching Antonio would lead to consequences, but he also knew it had been the right decision. Still, the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, the sports headlines were ablaze with news of Estrella FC's dramatic victory. For the first time in weeks, the club was receiving positive coverage, with much of the attention focused on Pedro Lima's standout performance. Photos of Pedro celebrating his goal were plastered across the front pages of sports websites and newspapers, and articles hailed him as the team's new hope. But the victory wasn't the only thing the media was talking about. The decision to bench Antonio had sparked a firestorm of controversy, and now the veteran player's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Rumors began to swirl. Was Antonio losing his influence within the squad? Was Marcos deliberately sidelining the veteran players in favor of the younger ones? Had there been a deeper rift brewing between the coach and his star player? Antonio wasn't about to let the narrative unfold without his input. By mid-afternoon, an interview with Antonio was circulating online. In the interview, he didn't hold back. He criticized Marcos openly, calling him inexperienced and disrespectful for benching him during such an important match. "This club has a legacy," Antonio said, his voice bitter but measured. "And that legacy isn't something you can just throw away in a few weeks because you want to play with new tactics. I've been here for over 10 years. I've given everything to this club, and for him to treat me like this, like I don't matter anymore, it's a slap in the face to everyone who's ever worn this jersey with pride." The media ate it up. Within hours, clips of Antonio's interview were being played on sports talk shows, and fans were flooding social media with their opinions. Some sided with Antonio, calling for Marcos to show more respect to the veterans who had brought Estrella FC its past glory. Others backed Marcos, arguing that football was a game that required evolution, and the team needed to move forward if it wanted to avoid stagnation. The divide among the fans was mirrored within the club. Marcos could feel the growing tension in the days following the victory. Though the younger players were firmly behind him, energized by the win, the veterans grew colder, more distant. Diego, one of Antonio's closest allies, had stopped speaking to Marcos altogether, while other senior players began questioning his tactical decisions in subtle ways. Pedro, on the other hand, found himself thrust into the spotlight. The media was clamoring for interviews, and his name was on the lips of every sports pundit in the country. He was hailed as a new face of Estrella FC, the player who could lead the team into a new era. But despite the praise, Pedro couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut since the confrontation in the locker room. Antonio's words echoed in his mind. The veteran's accusations about Marcos using him to make a point lingering like a shadow over his newfound success. Late one night, after another round of interviews and media obligations, Pedro found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and when he checked it, he saw a message from Antonio. "Don't get too comfortable, kid. You might be the new favorite now, but trust me, it doesn't last." Pedro stared at the message, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as bitterness from a player who couldn't handle the changing of the guard. But deep down, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if there was truth in what Antonio had said. He had seen how quickly things could change in football, how fast someone could go from being a hero to being sidelined. As Pedro lay there, the excitement of the victory slowly gave way to a sense of unease. Was he really the future of Estrella FC? Or was he just another pawn in a larger game that he didn't fully understand? The tension reached a boiling point a few days later when Marcos was called into a meeting with the club's board of directors. The victory had given him some breathing room, but the controversy surrounding Antonio's benching was still a topic of concern for the higher-ups. Marcos sat in the boardroom, facing the club's president and several other members of the board. The atmosphere was formal, almost cold. "We appreciate the win, Marcos," the president began, his tone measured. "But we need to talk about the situation with Antonio. There's been a lot of noise in the media, and we're getting pressure from both fans and sponsors. Antonio is an important figure at this club. He's been with us for over a decade, and we need to handle this carefully." Marcos nodded, though he could feel a flicker of frustration rising within him. "I understand, but I made the decision I thought was best for the team. It wasn't personal." The president exchanged a glance with the other board members. "We're not questioning your intentions, but the reality is that Antonio is still an influential figure. Benching him has created division within the squad, and we need to find a way to address that. The last thing we want is for the team to fall apart because of internal conflicts." Marcos knew what they were asking. They wanted him to smooth things over with Antonio, to find a way to bring the veteran back into the fold without losing control of the squad. But Marcos also knew that bringing Antonio back without addressing the deeper issues would only paper over the cracks. The division within the team would remain, festering beneath the surface, ready to explode at the first sign of trouble. "I'll speak with Antonio," Marcos said after a long pause. "But I need to be clear, this team can't move forward if we're stuck in the past. We need to focus on the future, and that means giving the younger players a chance." The president leaned back in his chair, considering Marcos' words. "We're not asking you to abandon your vision. We just need to keep the peace. Find a way to do that, and you'll have our full support." Marcos left the meeting with a heavy heart. He knew the board was right in their own way. Peace within the team was crucial if they were going to turn the season around. But how could he reconcile with Antonio when the veteran refused to accept that his time as the club's leader was coming to an end? As Marcos walked back to his office, his mind raced. The next steps would be critical. He had to find a way to unite the team, to bridge the gap between the veterans and the younger players, or everything he had worked for would come crashing down. Marcos stood in front of the large window in his office, staring out at the empty training grounds. It had been 3 days since their victory, but instead of feeling triumphant, he was overwhelmed by a sense of impending crisis. The fallout from his decision to bench Antonio during the match was growing beyond his control. The morning after the win, Estrella FC had been the talk of the town. The media hailed Pedro Lima as the team's future, praising his goal and assist as signs of a promising young talent. But those positive headlines quickly turned sour as Antonio's public comments began to dominate the news cycle. His accusations that Marcos disrespected the veterans and was trying to undermine the club's legacy hit hard, and the media was eager to fan the flames. By the second day, every sports show was discussing whether Marcos had made the right call. Some analysts supported him, pointing to the fact that the team had won the game and that Pedro Lima had shined in his new role. But many others questioned his leadership, arguing that he had alienated one of the club's most important players, Antonio, the symbol of Estrella FC's past glories. On the third day, things escalated. A popular sports commentator known for his blunt opinions aired a segment on his primetime show titled, "Is Marcos Almeida Destroying Estrella FC?" Clips from Antonio's interview were played on a loop, with a veteran player lamenting how he was being pushed aside by a coach who doesn't understand the history of the club. The commentator agreed, arguing that Marcos' focus on youth and his supposed disregard for the veterans was dangerous. He hinted that Marcos was trying to prove a point about his coaching philosophy rather than respecting the club's legacy. The segment spread quickly on social media, and by the next morning, the hashtag #RespectTheVeterans was trending among Estrella FC's fans. Marcos sighed as he turned away from the window. He knew the board was paying close attention to how the media was reacting. They had been pleased with the victory, but this growing controversy was putting pressure on them to take action. The last thing Estrella FC needed was a public feud between the coach and one of its most famous players. Just as Marcos was about to sit down at his desk, there was a knock on his office door. He turned to see Ricardo, one of the club's assistant coaches, standing in the doorway, holding a newspaper. "You've seen this, right?" Ricardo asked, handing the paper to Marcos. The front page featured a large photo of Antonio, his arms crossed and a scowl on his face. The headline read, "Antonio speaks out. Is Estrella FC forgetting its legends?" Marcos scanned the article, his eyes narrowing. It was more of the same. Criticism of his decision to bench Antonio, speculation about whether the veterans would stage a revolt, and questions about whether Marcos' methods were too radical for a club like Estrella FC. But one line stood out to him. Sources within the team suggest that the divide between the younger players and the veterans is growing, with many questioning whether Almeida can maintain control of the locker room. Marcos' jaw clenched. The leak was coming from inside the club. Someone was feeding the media information about the internal struggles, and it was making his job even harder. "I've spoken to some of the players," Ricardo said quietly. "The younger guys are still behind you, but the veterans, well, you know how it is. Antonio's got a lot of influence. They're siding with him." Marcos nodded, his mind racing. He knew that the veterans' loyalty to Antonio was strong, but he hadn't expected the situation to spiral this quickly. "I'll need to address this head-on," Marcos said, folding the newspaper and placing it on his desk. "We can't let this fester." Ricardo looked hesitant. "You think talking to Antonio will change anything? He seems pretty set on his course." "I'm not talking about Antonio," Marcos replied, his voice firm. "I'm talking about the team. We need to get everyone on the same page, or this season is over before it even begins." Later that afternoon, Marcos called a team meeting. The players gathered in the locker room, the air thick with anticipation. The younger players sat near the front, Pedro Lima included, while the veterans, led by Diego and a few others, lingered toward the back, their arms crossed defensively. Marcos stood in front of them, his expression serious. He could feel the divide in the room, but this was his moment to try and bridge it. "I'm sure you've all seen the media coverage," Marcos began, his voice calm but strong. "There's a lot of talk out there about what's happening inside this team, about the decisions I've made, and about where we're headed." He paused, scanning the room. Some players nodded. Others remained stone-faced. "I'm not going to stand here and defend every decision," Marcos continued, "because at the end of the day, the decisions I make are based on what I think is best for this team. Not for any one player, not for the media, but for Estrella FC." The room remained silent, the players waiting to see where this was going. "I know some of you aren't happy with the changes I've made," Marcos said, his gaze drifting to the veterans. "I know you're loyal to Antonio. He's been a leader here for a long time, and he's done great things for this club. But football is about moving forward. It's about adapting, growing, and making sure we're always getting better. That's what I'm trying to do." Diego, one of the veterans, shifted in his seat, his arms still crossed. "We get that, coach. But what about respect? Antonio's done more for this club than any of us. Benching him like that, it wasn't right." Marcos met Diego's gaze, his expression steady. "I respect everything Antonio has done for this club, but respect doesn't mean keeping someone on the field when it's not the best decision for the team. We won that game because of the changes we made. That's what matters." Diego's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything further. The room was still tense, but Marcos could see that some of the younger players were nodding in agreement. "We're not going to win games by holding on to the past," Marcos said, his voice rising slightly. "We're going to win by working together, by trusting each other, and by pushing ourselves to be better. I'm not asking you to forget the past. I'm asking you to fight for the future." Pedro Lima, sitting near the front, felt a surge of pride as Marcos spoke. The coach's words resonated with him, and he could feel the younger players rallying behind their leader. But he also knew that the veterans weren't going to be swayed so easily. Antonio's influence still loomed large, and the divide between the old guard and the new generation was far from healed. As the meeting ended, the players dispersed, the tension still hanging in the air. Marcos remained behind, watching as they left the locker room. He knew this battle wasn't over. The veterans would continue to resist, and the media would keep feeding off the conflict. But for now, he had done what he could. That evening, as Marco sat in his office, reviewing the footage from the previous game, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Pedro. "Coach, I just wanted to say I'm with you. Whatever happens, I'm going to keep pushing. Thanks for believing in me." Marco smiled faintly as he read the message. Pedro's loyalty was a bright spot in the midst of the storm. He knew the young striker had a long way to go, but his potential was undeniable. If the rest of the team could show even half of Pedro's commitment, they might just be able to turn this season around. But as he looked out at the empty training grounds once more, Marcos couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were still to come. The media's scrutiny, the division within the team, the pressure from the board, it was all mounting. And Antonio wasn't going to back down without a fight. The fallout from Antonio's media interview continued to echo through the halls of Estrella FC. The tension in the locker room had grown worse since Marcos' meeting with the team. The younger players were still behind their coach, but the veterans, especially those closest to Antonio, had grown increasingly distant. Training sessions had become a battlefield of silent resistance. When Marcos introduced new drills or tactics, the younger players responded with enthusiasm, while the veterans dragged their feet, sometimes openly defying his instructions. The division in the team was no longer just a simmering undercurrent. It was out in the open, and everyone could feel it. Pedro Lima was caught in the middle of this conflict. He had earned his place as a starter in the last match, and Marcos' faith in him had given him a sense of confidence he hadn't felt before. But the tension between the veterans and the younger players weighed heavily on him. Antonio, once someone he admired, now treated him with cold disdain, and even some of the other veteran players had stopped speaking to him. During one particularly tense training session, the divide between the two groups reached a boiling point. Marcos had set up a high-intensity scrimmage designed to test the players' stamina and tactical awareness. The younger players, led by Pedro, were pressing hard, following Marcos' instructions to the letter. But the veterans, led by Diego and another midfielder, Jorge, seemed to be going through the motions, barely putting in any effort. As the scrimmage progressed, frustration began to build. Pedro, who was playing up front, noticed that the veterans weren't pressing as they should have been, leaving gaps in the midfield. He tried to cover the space himself, but it wasn't enough. The play broke down again and again, and soon the younger players were shouting in frustration. "What's going on back there?" Pedro called out, his voice tight with frustration. "We're getting overrun." Diego, who had been jogging lazily back to his position, shot Pedro a look of irritation. "Maybe if you weren't running around like a headless chicken, we'd actually get something done." Pedro bristled at the comment. "We're trying to follow the coach's instructions. If you're not going to put in the effort, why are you even out here?" The veterans heard the challenge in Pedro's voice and stopped in their tracks. Diego narrowed his eyes. "Watch your mouth, kid. You don't know the first thing about what this club means. You've been here 5 minutes." Pedro didn't back down. "I know enough to see when someone's not giving 100%. If you don't want to be here, then don't." Before Pedro could finish, Diego stormed across the field, shoving Pedro in the chest. Pedro stumbled backward, but quickly regained his footing, his heart pounding. The other players stopped moving, the scrimmage forgotten as they watched the two square off. "You think you're the future of this club?" Diego spat, his face twisted in anger. "You think running fast and scoring one goal makes you better than us? We built this team. We made this club what it is. And you're just a kid who got lucky." Pedro's fists clenched at his sides. The frustration, the pressure, the constant criticism from the veterans, it all boiled over in that moment. I'm not the one dragging this team down, Pedro shot back. You and Antonio, you're so stuck in the past. You can't even see what's happening right in front of you. Before the situation could escalate further, Marcos blew his whistle sharply from the sidelines, marching over to break up the confrontation. That's enough, he barked, stepping between Pedro and Diego. Everyone back to their positions. Now, the players hesitated for a moment, the tension still crackling in the air, but slowly, they began to disperse. Diego gave Pedro one last glare before turning away, and Pedro, breathing heavily, walked back to his position, his mind racing. As the training session continued, the atmosphere remained tense, but the confrontation had laid everything bare. The team was divided, and unless something changed soon, that division would only grow wider. Later that day, after training had ended, Marcos called Pedro into his office. The young striker entered, still feeling the heat of the earlier confrontation. He sat down, his legs still jittery with adrenaline. Marcos sat behind his desk, his expression serious. I saw what happened out there today. He began. You held your ground, but you need to be careful. Pedro looked down at his hands, still clenched in his lap. I couldn't stand it anymore, coach. They're not even trying. It's like they want us to fail. I know, Marco said, leaning forward. But you need to remember that they've been here a long time. They've seen a lot of changes, and not all of them have been good. For them, this isn't just about football, it's about their identity. You're part of the new generation, and that scares them. Pedro nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. To him, it was simple. If you weren't willing to put in the effort, you didn't deserve to be on the field. But he also knew that things weren't always as straightforward as they seemed. Look, Marcos continued, his tone softening, I believe in you. You've earned your place here. But you need to stay focused. The veterans, they're not going to change overnight. But we can't let this team fall apart. We need to find a way to move forward. Together, Pedro looked up, meeting Marcos' gaze. The coach's words gave him a sense of clarity, and he felt a renewed determination take hold. I'll do whatever it takes, coach, Pedro said. I want to help this team. Marcos smiled faintly. I know you do, and you will. But just remember, this isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about proving yourself right. That night, as Pedro lay in bed, he thought about what Marcos had said. The conflict with the veterans wasn't just about tactics or effort. It was about identity, about the old guard feeling like they were being pushed out in favor of the new generation. Antonio, Diego, Jorge, they were all fighting to hold on to something that was slipping away, and Pedro was caught in the middle of that struggle. As he drifted off to sleep, Pedro resolved to stay focused on what he could control, his game, his effort, and his commitment to the team. He couldn't change how the veterans felt, but he could prove, day by day, that he belonged on that field. But deep down, Pedro knew that the next few weeks would be critical. The team was on the brink of a deeper crisis, and unless something changed soon, Estrella FC's season and its future could be in serious jeopardy. The tension in the locker room had reached a boiling point. Every day, the gap between the younger players and the veterans widened, and despite Marcos' efforts to keep the team united, the fractures were becoming impossible to ignore. The training sessions were filled with half-hearted effort from the older players, and even the victories on the pitch were beginning to feel hollow. It wasn't just about the tactical disagreements anymore. This was personal. Antonio's influence over the veterans was strong, and the more he resisted Marcos' leadership, the more divided the team became. With every passing day, it felt as though Estrella FC was being pulled in two directions. One toward the future, with Pedro Lima and the younger players embracing the modern approach that Marcos had introduced, and the other toward the past, with Antonio clinging to the glory days that seemed to be slipping further away. Marcos knew that something had to give. The team couldn't continue like this. The board was growing restless. The media's scrutiny had intensified, and the players were beginning to lose faith, not just in each other, but in the club itself. It was clear that the time had come for a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. The final showdown came to a head in the most unexpected way. It was a cold Tuesday afternoon when the board called Marcos into an emergency meeting. The president of the club, along with several key directors, sat around a large table in the boardroom, their expressions serious. The meeting had an air of finality about it, and Marcos could feel the pressure mounting even before anyone had spoken a word. The president leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Marcos, we appreciate everything you've done so far. The results have been promising, and we can see the potential in your approach. But we need to address the situation with Antonio." Marcos nodded, though inside, he already knew what was coming. "I understand. The division in the team is growing," the president continued. "Antonio is still an important figure in this club. His connection with the veterans, with the fans, it runs deep. We can't afford for the situation to spiral out of control. We need you to find a way to bring him back into the fold. This team can't succeed if it's divided." Marcos clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to argue. He had heard this before. Everyone was looking for a way to keep the peace, but they weren't seeing the bigger picture. Antonio wasn't just causing division. He was standing in the way of the club's progress. But Marcos also knew that openly saying this to the board would only make things worse. "I'll speak with him," Marcos said after a long pause. "But I need you to understand something. If this team is going to move forward, we need to evolve. We can't stay stuck in the past, no matter how much history we have. Antonio has been a great player for this club, but right now, his influence is becoming a problem. I'm not asking you to choose sides, but if you want this team to succeed, we need to trust the process." The president leaned back in his chair, exchanging glances with the other board members. "We understand your position, Marcos, but we need results, and we need harmony in the locker room. Find a way to make this work." The confrontation with Antonio happened later that evening. After the meeting with the board, Marcos went straight to the training facility, determined to resolve the situation once and for all. As he entered the locker room, he found Antonio and Diego sitting on the bench, discussing something in low voices. The moment they saw Marcos, the conversation stopped. "We need to talk," Marcos said, his voice firm. Antonio looked up, his expression hard. "About what? You've made it pretty clear how you feel about me." Marcos walked over, standing in front of the two veterans. "This has to stop, Antonio. The division you're creating is tearing the team apart. We can't win games like this." Antonio scoffed, leaning back against the lockers. "I'm not the one tearing the team apart, Marcos. You are. You've been here a few months, and you think you know everything about this club, but you don't. You don't understand what this team means, what it stands for. You've disrespected the veterans, the players who built this club. And for what? To push your little project with Pedro?" Marcos felt his patience wearing thin. He had expected resistance, but the blatant disrespect was starting to wear him down. "This isn't about Pedro. This is about the future of the team. The game is changing, Antonio. We need to change with it, or we'll be left behind. You're holding on to the past, and it's dragging everyone down." Antonio's eyes flashed with anger. The past is what made this club what it is. Without me, without the veterans, this club would be nothing. Marcos shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "The past won't win us games today, Antonio. It's not about what you've done before. It's about what you're doing now. And right now, you're not helping this team. You're hurting it." The locker room fell silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Diego looked from Antonio to Marcos, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though the conversation might turn into something more physical, but Antonio finally broke the silence. "So that's it," Antonio said, his voice low and filled with bitterness. "You're just going to throw me away like I don't matters?" Marcos's voice softened, though the resolve in his words remained. "You still matter, Antonio, but you need to decide what kind of role you want to play. If you're willing to get on board with where we're going, there's a place for you. But if you're going to keep fighting against me, against this team, I can't use you. The choice is yours." Antonio stared at him for a long moment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Marcos could see the pride in his eyes, the years of being the team's leader weighing heavily on his shoulders. But he also saw the fear of being left behind, of being forgotten as the club moved forward without him. Finally, Antonio stood up, his eyes cold and distant. "I've made my choice," he said quietly. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the locker room, leaving Marcos and Diego standing in silence. Marcos exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had known this confrontation was inevitable, but it still hurt to see it play out this way. Antonio was a legend at the club, and now he was walking away, not just from the team, but from everything he had helped build. Diego stood up, his expression conflicted. "He's been here a long time, coach," Diego said softly. "But maybe it's time for something new." Marcos nodded, grateful for the glimmer of understanding in Diego's voice. "It's time for all of us to move forward." That night, as Marcos drove home, he thought about the road ahead. The confrontation with Antonio had been brutal but necessary. The team couldn't move forward with one foot stuck in the past. But there was still work to be done. The veterans would need time to adjust, and the younger players needed to keep growing. Pedro Lima, especially, had become the symbol of the team's future, and Marcos knew that nurturing his talent would be crucial in the months to come. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcos felt a sense of relief wash over him. The hardest part was behind him, or so he hoped. The team was still divided, but the path forward was clearer now. It was time to rebuild, time to unite the players behind a common goal. But as Marcos closed his eyes that night, he knew that the battles were far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more tests of his leadership, more resistance from those who weren't ready to let go of the past. But for now, he had taken the first step toward a new beginning. The departure of Antonio Freitas sent shockwaves through Estrella FC. For over a decade, Antonio had been the face of the club, a player who embodied everything the team had stood for. Now, with him gone, the club found itself at a crossroads. The veterans who had once rallied behind Antonio were left in a state of uncertainty, while the younger players, like Pedro Lima, were starting to step into the spotlight. The news of Antonio's exit hit the media within hours, and the reaction was swift. Fans, journalists, and former players all had their opinions, and the debate raged on about whether this was the right move for the club. Some saw it as a necessary step forward, a sign that Estrella FC was ready to embrace the future. Others viewed it as a betrayal, a dismissal of the club's legacy, and a disrespect to a player who had given everything to the team. Marcos tried to block out the noise as best he could. He knew that the decision to part ways with Antonio would be controversial, but he also knew it had been the right one. The team couldn't afford to stay divided, and Antonio had made it clear that he wasn't willing to move forward with the new direction. But even with Antonio gone, the challenges were far from over. The board had called another meeting, and Marcos knew that his future at the club was still under scrutiny. The results on the pitch had been improving, but the internal strife had left many questioning whether Marcos was the right man to lead the team through this period of transition. As Marcos entered the boardroom, the tension was palpable. The president sat at the head of the table, flanked by the same directors who had been present at the last meeting. This time, however, there was an air of finality to the proceedings. Everyone knew that this meeting would decide the club's next steps, whether they would continue under Marcos' leadership or look for a new direction. "Marcos," the president began, his voice measured, "we've seen the news about Antonio's departure. It's clear that the situation within the team has reached a turning point. We've called this meeting to discuss where we go from here." Marcos nodded, waiting for the president to continue. He knew this was coming. The board had to address the situation, both for the sake of the team and for the club's image. "The results on the pitch have been improving," the president said, glancing at the other board members. "But we can't ignore the fact that the locker room has been divided. Antonio was an important figure at this club, and his departure will have repercussions." We need to be sure that you can lead this team through the turbulence ahead. Marcos took a deep breath, his mind racing as he prepared to respond. I understand the gravity of the situation, he began, his voice steady. And I won't deny that the last few weeks have been challenging. But I believe that this team is ready to move forward. We've laid the groundwork for a new approach, one that embraces both the experience of the veterans and the energy of the younger players. He paused, scanning the room to gauge their reactions. The board members listened intently, their expressions unreadable. Antonio was a great player, Marcos continued, but the game is changing. We can't hold on to the past if we want to succeed in the future. The decision to part ways with Antonio wasn't easy, but it was necessary for the good of the team. Now, we have an opportunity to unite the players behind a common goal. The younger players, like Pedro Lima, are stepping up, and with the right support, I believe we can turn this season around. The president exchanged glances with the other board members before speaking again. We've seen the potential in the younger players, and we recognize the progress that's been made. But the concerns about unity within the team remain. How do you plan to bring the veterans back on board? Marcos had anticipated this question. The veterans had been the cornerstone of the team for years, and with Antonio gone, there was a risk that they would feel alienated. But Marcos had a plan. I've already started reaching out to the veterans, Marcos said. I've spoken with Diego and Jorge, and I'm working to ensure that they feel valued in this new direction. I'm not here to push anyone out. I'm here to build a team that can succeed together. The veterans have a lot to offer, and I'm committed to integrating their experience with the energy of the younger players. But we need to move forward as one team. The board members nodded thoughtfully, and the president leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. Marcos, the president said slowly, we believe in your vision. We've seen the results on the field, and we've seen the potential in the players. But this is your final chance to prove that you can unite the team. We can't afford any more division. If you can bring the veterans and the younger players together, we're willing to back you. But if the division continues, we'll have to reconsider. Marcos nodded, his chest tight with both relief and pressure. He had been given a lifeline, but the stakes were higher than ever. The board was willing to give him one last chance. But if he couldn't deliver, his time at Estrella FC would be over. I understand, Marcos said firmly. I won't let you down. In the days following the meeting, Marcos threw himself into the task of unifying the team. He knew that winning the trust of the veterans was crucial, and he spent hours in one-on-one conversations with players like Diego and Jorge, listening to their concerns and finding ways to integrate their experience into the new tactical approach. The younger players, particularly Pedro, continued to shine in training, and Marcos knew that he needed to balance their enthusiasm with the steadying presence of the veterans. He began organizing team-building activities outside of training, bringing the players together in an attempt to break down the barriers that had formed in the wake of Antonio's departure. Slowly, the atmosphere in the locker room began to shift. The veterans were still wary, but they were no longer openly defiant. Diego, who had been one of Antonio's closest allies, began to step into a more positive leadership role, guiding the younger players while also supporting Marcos' vision. The younger players, led by Pedro, responded with even more determination, eager to prove that they were ready to take the team to the next level. But despite the progress, there was still work to be done. The next match was approaching, and the pressure to deliver a cohesive, united performance was immense. The board was watching closely, and the fans were still divided over the decision to part ways with Antonio. As the team prepared for the game, Marcos stood in the center of the locker room, addressing his players with the calm authority he had worked so hard to maintain. "This is our moment," Marcos said, his voice steady but filled with intensity. "We've been through a lot, and we've had our differences. But today, we play as one team. We fight for each other. No more divisions, no more looking back. It's time to show the world what this team is made of." The players nodded, their expressions focused. Pedro, sitting at the front, felt a surge of pride as he listened to his coach. Marcos had stood by him, had believed in him when others hadn't, and now it was his turn to repay that faith. As the players took to the pitch, the weight of the moment hung over them. This wasn't just another game. It was a test of everything Marcos had worked for. The board's backing, the unity of the team, the future of Estrella FC. It all rested on the outcome of this match. The whistle blew and the game began. The stadium was buzzing with anticipation. Fans filled the stands, their faces a mix of hope and anxiety. This match had become more than just a game. It was a symbol of Estrella FC's future. Everyone knew what was at stake. The board had made it clear that this was a defining moment for the club and for Marcos Almeida's tenure as head coach. As the players lined up on the pitch, the air was thick with tension. The veterans stood alongside the younger players, their expressions determined but uncertain. This was the first time since Antonio's departure that the team had taken the field together, and everyone was watching to see if they could play as a united force. Marcos stood on the sidelines, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent the last few days trying to mend the fractures within the team, speaking individually to the veterans, reminding the younger players of their responsibilities. He had done everything he could to bring them together, but now it was out of his hands. It was up to the players to execute his vision, to show that they could fight for each other. Pedro Lima stood at the center of the pitch, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew that all eyes were on him, not just the fans, but the entire football world. The media had labeled him as the future of Estrella FC, and today he had the chance to prove them right. But the pressure was immense, and Pedro couldn't help but think of the words Antonio had sent him weeks ago. "Don't get too comfortable, kid. It doesn't last." The referee's whistle blew, and the game began. From the first whistle, it was clear that this was going to be a battle. The opposition came out strong, pressing high, and looking to dominate possession. For the first 10 minutes, Estrella FC struggled to find their rhythm. The veterans were cautious, hesitant to push too far forward, while the younger players were eager but lacking in composure. Marcos paced the sidelines, his hands clenched into fists. He could see the tension on the field, the uncertainty that was holding the team back. But then, something shifted. In the 15th minute, Pedro received the ball just inside the opposition's half. He turned quickly, shaking off his defender with a burst of speed, and drove toward the goal. For a split second, the defense hesitated, unsure whether to close him down or wait for support. Pedro seized the moment. He threaded a perfectly timed pass to Jorge, one of the veteran midfielders, who had made a rare forward run into space. Jorge controlled the ball expertly and without hesitation, fired a low shot into the bottom corner of the net. The stadium erupted. Marcos let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was a breakthrough, not just in the game, but in the dynamic of the team. The veterans and the younger players were finally working together. The goal wasn't just a result of individual brilliance. It was a product of teamwork, of trust. Pedro and Jorge exchanged a brief nod as they jogged back to their positions. It wasn't an emotional celebration, but it was a sign of progress. They were starting to trust each other, starting to believe in the collective effort. As the game progressed, Estrella FC grew in confidence. The veterans, led by Diego and Jorge, began to assert themselves in the midfield, using their experience to control the tempo of the game. Pedro and the younger players, meanwhile, continued to provide the energy and pace that kept the opposition on the back foot. In the 60th minute, the opposition equalized with a stunning strike from outside the box. The crowd fell silent, the tension creeping back into the air. But unlike in previous games, there was no panic on the pitch. Marcos had drilled the importance of composure into his players, and it showed. The team regrouped quickly, refusing to let the setback derail their focus. In the 75th minute, Pedro found himself with another chance. He received the ball on the edge of the box, with two defenders closing in fast. For a moment, it looked like the opportunity was lost. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Pedro saw Diego making a late run into the box. Without thinking, Pedro flicked the ball into Diego's path, and the veteran didn't hesitate. With a powerful strike, Diego buried the ball into the top corner, 2-1. The stadium exploded with noise, and for the first time in what felt like months, The team celebrated together. Pedro and Diego embraced on the pitch, the younger players rushing to join in. The veterans were smiling, the barriers that had once divided them now beginning to fall away. Marcos watched from the sidelines, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. This was the team he had envisioned, a team that could blend the experience of the veterans with the energy of the younger players, a team that could fight for each other no matter what. The final whistle blew, and Estrella FC had won. The players collapsed onto the pitch in relief, their faces filled with a mix of exhaustion and joy. The fans in the stands were on their feet, chanting the names of the players, their belief in the team restored. Marcos stood by the dugout, watching as the players celebrated. Pedro and Diego walked off the pitch together, their arms around each other's shoulders. Jorge was laughing with some of the younger midfielders, and the tension that had once plagued the locker room seemed to have melted away. As Marcos made his way back to the locker room, he was stopped by the club's president. The older man extended his hand, his expression warm. "Well done, Marcos," the president said, shaking his hand firmly. "You've done what we asked. You've united the team." Marcos nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He had known that this match would be a defining moment, and now it was clear that the board was behind him. But more than that, the team was finally moving in the right direction. Back in the locker room, the atmosphere was electric. The players were celebrating, their voices loud with victory. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of unity, of shared purpose. The veterans were laughing and joking with the younger players, the tension of the past few weeks seemingly forgotten. Pedro sat on the bench, his body aching from the match but his heart light. He had proven himself today, not just to the fans or the media, but to his teammates. He was part of this team now, and he had earned their respect. Marcos watched from the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He could see the bonds forming between the players, the connections that had been missing for so long. This was what he had been working toward, the unity, the trust, the belief in each other. And now, after all the battles, both on and off the field, they were finally starting to come together. But Marcos knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more tests of their resolve. The road to success was long, and the journey was far from over. But for now, he allowed himself to savor the moment, to enjoy the feeling of having taken the first step toward building something lasting. As the celebrations continued, Pedro caught Marcos' eye from across the room. The young striker smiled, and Marcos nodded in return. They didn't need to say anything. Their shared understanding was enough. They were ready for whatever came next.